So welcome back to those who joined us for the previous session. And if you're just joining us now, welcome. I just wanted to remind everyone that today's agenda and the presenter bios are available on the conference website. And we will be making the slides and the recording available next week. And we will send out a notification to participants when that is available. So our next presenter will discuss differential privacy. Michael Hawes is Senior Advisor for Data Access and Privacy at the U.S. Census Bureau. He's responsible for outreach and engagement with the Census Bureau's data users on issues relating to the impact of privacy protection methodologies on the accessibility and usability of census data. Welcome, Michael. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Let me just share my screen here. And can you just confirm that you can see my slides?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me join you today. So we've been getting a lot of questions about the 2020 Census Disclosure Avoidance System. So today I'm going to give you just a quick walkthrough on the privacy protections that we use at the census, why we've decided we need to modernize and improve those privacy protections for the 2020 census. And then I'll also walk through some of our recent updates on our progress towards that. Before I start, I just want to thank my colleagues at the Census Bureau who've contributed to the information that's contained in my presentation, and to say that any opinions or viewpoints I express today are entirely my own and do not represent the viewpoints of the U.S. Census Bureau. So the Census Bureau's commitment to privacy and confidentiality is absolutely critical to our ability to produce high-quality statistics about the nation's people and economy. And protecting the privacy of our respondents and the confidentiality of their data is a legal requirement for us under Title 13, Sections 8B and 9, but perhaps more importantly, it's a core element of our institutional culture. If we weren't able to protect the public's confidence in our ability to safeguard the data, we wouldn't be able to collect those data in the first place. So this is absolutely critical to our ability to collect data and then be able to produce quality statistics. And when we publish our data products, we can't merely consider the privacy risks that exist today. Our legal and ethical obligations to respect respondent confidentiality require us to make sure that when we publish those data products, that they're properly protected against privacy threats that may emerge tomorrow, next week, or next year. Over the past century, the Census Bureau has been a world leader in the research, design, and implementation of a whole family of statistical methods that can be used to safeguard privacy in public data releases. And as new privacy threats have been identified over the years, the Census Bureau has worked diligently to improve the statistical safeguards that we use to mitigate those emerging threats. Our adoption of differential privacy or formal privacy for the 2020 census is merely the latest step in what has been a long history of innovation and continuous improvement to the privacy protections that we use. And this is a necessary step to counter the new 21st century privacy threats that have emerged over the recent years. The real challenge that we face is that we collect enormous amounts of information to fulfill our mission to produce quality statistics about the nation. As I'm sure all of you know, information tabulated from the decennial census, for example, is used for a wide array of purposes. Census data are used to apportion seats in the House of Representatives, to draw district boundaries for federal, state, and local elections, and to distribute over $675 billion in federal funding each year. But beyond these uses, census data are also routinely used for critical decision-making at all levels of government, and they enable policymakers, businesses, analysts, and researchers across the country to be able to measure and assess trends about who we are and where we're going as a society. But in order to support these myriad and diverse uses of census data, it requires us to publish an enormous amount of statistics and tables, often at very fine levels of of granularity of characteristics and geographic specificity. Unfortunately, we know that every time you publish any statistic that you calculate from a confidential data source, the publication of that statistic is going to reveal or leak a tiny bit of confidential information in the process. In 2003, it was mathematically demonstrated that if you release too many statistics at too high a degree of accuracy, well, then eventually you're going to reveal the entire underlying confidential data. And this challenge is even greater when you consider some new privacy threats that have emerged over the past few years. They say that nothing on the internet ever goes away, and the same is certainly true for data once it's gone out into the wild, so to speak. Over the past 20 to 30 years, we've seen a massive proliferation of third-party data that could be used to re-identify individuals in our statistical data products. And technology has also improved substantially over the last several years. Computers can now easily perform the complex matching algorithms that would be necessary to leverage external data in a re-identification attack on the data that the Census Bureau publishes. And these parallel trends aren't abstract concerns, they're real and concrete threats to protecting confidentiality that we need to address. So there's a common misperception that aggregating data is sufficient to protect privacy. And while that may have once been the case and may still be true for some limited data releases, it is not sufficient to protect privacy in large-scale statistical data products. In fact, aggregate tabular data can often be thought of like a giant game of Sudoku. If you're familiar with Sudoku puzzles, you know that if there are enough numbers pre-populated into the puzzle grid, well, then there's going to be one and only one solution to that puzzle. Well, the same is true for aggregate statistical tables. If you publish enough data tables with enough disaggregation by different characteristics and geographies, well, then eventually there would be one and only one set of individual level records that could have yielded those published tabular results. And while it may have seemed unthinkable a decade ago, computer algorithms can now perform these reconstructions of those individual level data from aggregate tabular data quite easily and quickly. So let's look at a toy example. Imagine that you collected some basic demographic information about the 7 people who live on a particular block. You then publish some aggregate descriptive statistics about those people. How many were female? How many were Black? What's the median age of married individuals, and so on. Well, with those basic aggregate statistics, it's a trivial matter to solve for the only set of individual level records that could have yielded those aggregate results. I say trivial and I really mean it. It took a 2013 MacBook Pro a grand total of 0.2 seconds to solve the 164 equations that would be necessary to convert those aggregate tabular data on the left into individual level records for each of the block's inhabitants on the right. And so our would-be attacker now has these individual level data for everyone on the block, but can she actually re-identify any of them? Well, it turns out this is also a relatively trivial exercise. While the reconstructed data did not contain names, they did have some indirect identifiers that could be used to link to an outside data source that does have names. In this particular example, they could use block location, age, and sex to match the reconstructed data to third-party data, say, for example, voter registration lists for the block. Now it's easy to attach the names to those individual records, and you've just learned Jane, Joe, and John's race and relationship status. So with the risks of reconstruction and re-identification attacks in mind, and the knowledge that these types of attacks are getting easier and easier as computers improve and as external data about us increases, the Census Bureau decided to conduct a simulated attack on the 2010 census to see just how vulnerable the privacy protections we used in 2010 are to this type of attack. So remember when I said a moment ago that it was demonstrated that every release of any calculation or statistic derived from a confidential data source leaks a tiny amount of confidential information. Well, the 2010 census collected a handful of attributes for the approximately 309 million people in the United States, giving us a total of 1.9 billion confidential data points that we had to protect. Yet the 2010 census data products released over 150 billion aggregate statistics that were derived from those data. We wanted to see if that was enough to reconstruct the individual level records for the 2010 census. Well, turns out, yes, it was enough to reconstruct the individual level records. In fact, using only a small portion of the 2010 public data products, Census Bureau researchers were able to accurately reconstruct individual level data for all 6 million inhabited blocks in the United States. Moreover, we were able to reconstruct detailed individual level information, including sex, age plus or minus 1 year, race, and ethnicity for 71% of the entire US population. And then linking these reconstructed records to commercially available data from the time period, we're able to confirm accurate re-identifications on all variables for 52 million people. So it should go without saying that the results of these reconstruction and re-identification experiments were a real eye-opener for us. So recognizing the growing threats of these types of attacks and the knowledge that increasingly powerful computer algorithms are being developed each year that could make these types of attacks ever easier, the Census Bureau recognized that our traditional approaches to protecting privacy in our public data products were becoming increasingly insufficient. So in order to understand the mechanisms that we're using to improve privacy protections, it's helpful to understand a little bit about how disclosure avoidance or these statistical safeguards work more basically. So at their core, disclosure avoidance methods seek to make these types of reconstruction and re-identification attacks more difficult by either reducing the precision of the data that you publish, by removing vulnerable records or cells or pieces of data from what you're publishing, or by adding uncertainty to the data, adding noise or error. And commonly used traditional methods of disclosure avoidance include things like complementary suppression of cells or tables in your data releases, rounding the values that you publish, recoding extreme variables or extreme values of the data, either at the top or bottom end of the spectrum, sampling from a larger distribution, swapping records like we used in 2010, or other forms of injecting or infusing noise or error into the data. The problem with disclosure avoidance is that any statistical technique that you use to protect privacy in your data products is going to fundamentally impose a trade-off between the degree of privacy protection on the one hand and the resulting accuracy of the data on the other. You could call this a feature, not a bug. The mechanism by which you protect privacy is reducing the accuracy or fitness for use of the data. It's essential to how you protect privacy. And the mechanisms that you do to introduce that uncertainty, to introduce that degree of privacy protection, are determined by the parameters of the method that you select. And that could be things like your record swapping rates or your noise infusion parameters, the threshold you use for cell suppression, and so on. And those parameters determine this trade-off between the strength of your privacy protection on the one side and the resulting accuracy or usability of the data on the other. Which brings us to another problem, and that's that traditional approaches to disclosure avoidance provide very little ability to quantify or measure privacy protection or privacy risk. They rely largely on expert assessment and subjective assessments of how large the risk is and how sufficient your protections are. And then when you're faced with rising disclosure risk over the years, disclosure avoidance practitioners would have to adjust their implementation parameters. But the relative scattershot and subjective nature of traditional approaches to disclosure avoidance mean that when those parameters are adjusted, you're likely to overprotect some data, essentially making them less usable than they might be otherwise, or less accurate than they could be, while at the same time underprotecting some of your more vulnerable records. So this is a relatively inefficient way of trying to protect privacy. Which brings us to differential privacy. So the Census Bureau is adopting a framework known as differential privacy to protect the 2020 census. So to understand what this means, it's helpful to realize that differential privacy is not a disclosure avoidance method per se, the same way that swapping or suppression are methods of disclosure avoidance. Rather, differential privacy is better thought of as kind of an accounting framework, a privacy accounting framework for defining and then quantifying privacy risk on the one side and privacy protection on the other. We know that every individual that's reflected in any particular statistic that you publish contributes towards that statistic's value. They're reflected in the data that you publish. We also know, as I mentioned before, that every statistic that you publish is going to reveal or leak a small amount of confidential information. Well, differential privacy, as this kind of privacy accounting framework, allows you to assess and measure each individual's contribution to each statistic that you're publishing. And by measuring this contribution, it then allows you to determine and then limit how much information about that individual will leak in any statistic that you're publishing. So when you combine this privacy accounting framework of differential privacy with a disclosure avoidance approach like noise injection, differential privacy allows you to precisely control the amount of confidential information leakage that's going to occur in your published statistics. And now this approach offers a number of significant advantages over traditional disclosure avoidance methods. For starters, unlike the kind of scattershot approach of traditional methods, differentially private noise injection is infinitely tunable. You have a number of parameters or dials, if you will, that could be set anywhere on the spectrum from perfect privacy at the one extreme to perfect accuracy at the other. Perhaps more importantly, the privacy guarantees of this kind of approach are mathematically provable and they're future-proof. So you don't have to worry about what new third-party data might become available to use in an attack, or how those computer algorithms might improve and make re-identification easier. These guarantees are future-proof because you're limiting the basic information that's leaking in the process of publishing your statistics, not trying to protect against any particular attack. And lastly, the ability to precisely calibrate these parameters or dials that determine how much statistical noise you're going to be adding into the data you publish allows you to get optimal data accuracy for any given level of privacy protection. It's a more efficient mechanism for protecting privacy than most traditional approaches to disclosure avoidance. So, the only way that you could absolutely eliminate all risk of re-identification would be to never publish any usable data at all. And clearly, as the nation's leading provider of quality statistics about the country, not publishing quality data is not an option for us. So you have to find the optimal balance where you're providing data that are sufficiently accurate for their intended uses, while also being sufficiently noisy to meet our legal and ethical obligations to safeguard the data. And finding this balance is at times a tricky policy decision that has to be made. But once you've identified that optimal point on the spectrum between perfect privacy with unusable data on the one extreme and perfect data with no privacy protections on the other, that point becomes known as your privacy loss budget. You'll often hear this abbreviated PLB or represented by the Greek letter epsilon. Now, much like a monetary budget, the lower your privacy loss budget, the less privacy you're willing to give up for the sake of data accuracy. An epsilon of 0 would be the world of perfect privacy with useless data, and an epsilon of infinity would be the world of perfect data with no privacy protections at all. So what does all this mean for the 2020 census? Well, for starters, let me be absolutely clear that the Census Bureau's adoption of differentially private noise injection for the 2020 census does not alter our constitutional mandate to apportion seats for the House of Representatives using the actual enumeration of state populations. So in the apportionment data product that we released a couple weeks ago, there was no noise added to those state population totals. And in our upcoming data products, state population totals will be reported exactly as enumerated as well. The remaining data in our data products, including the data in the Public Law 94-171 redistricting data files, will have privacy protections applied to them as they have in prior censuses. Only this time around, the noise that we're injecting will be coming from our differentially private disclosure avoidance system rather than from the record swapping mechanism that we used for past censuses. So I mentioned before that the privacy loss budget, or epsilon, determines where on that spectrum from perfect privacy to perfect accuracy the resulting data will be. Now, selecting that privacy loss budget is a policy decision, and the Census Bureau's Data Stewardship Executive Policy Committee will be making that determination for the first of the privacy protected data products to come out, which will be the redistricting data. They'll be making that decision for the redistricting file next month. But there's a number of decisions that have to be made regarding this privacy loss budget. For starters, you have to allocate that budget across the various data products that you're going to be producing. Each data product receives a share of that overall budget, and the relative size of the share allocated to each of those data products will determine their relative accuracy compared to each other. If you give a larger share to one data product, it will be more accurate. But because the privacy loss budget will be fixed, that means that other data products might receive a smaller share. So DCEP is going to have to make decisions about how much privacy loss budget to allocate to each of the different data products that comprise the 2020 census data products. More so, within those data products, you have a large number in most cases, of different tabulations at different levels of geography that also need to receive shares of the privacy loss budget. So the amount of privacy loss budget that you allocate to any particular data element at any particular geographic level is going to determine the relative accuracy of those tabulations vis-a-vis each other. And those are policy decisions as well. So what have we been doing recently with the disclosure avoidance system? Well, from December through March, our disclosure avoidance system team was focusing their attention on tuning our algorithms to ensure fitness for use for the PL 94-171 redistricting data. And we did this by conducting over 600 full-scale runs of our disclosure avoidance system against the complete PL 94-171 data product schema using 2010 census data as the input. Our goal in conducting these experiments was to be able to evaluate the results on accuracy of varying a number of these parameters or dials within the system. We were looking at what was the impact of different overall levels of privacy loss budget. What's the impact of different query strategies within the algorithm? What the impact of allocating different levels of privacy loss budget across tabulations at different geographic levels, and allocation of the privacy loss budget across the individual tabulations within each geographic level. And throughout these experiments, we worked with subject matter experts in our demographic and decennial directorates to evaluate the results to inform the parameter setting. So since October of 2019, the Census Bureau has been periodically releasing demonstration data products using 2010 census data run through our disclosure avoidance system to enable our data users to evaluate the results and to help inform improvements to the system and improvements in the tuning for fitness for use. The first 4 sets of demonstration data that we released in October of 2019, and then May, September, and November of 2020 used a relatively conservative privacy loss budget, erring on the side of privacy in that spectrum, that was set by DCEP for that original October 2019 demonstration set. And we kept that privacy loss budget constant across those 4 demonstration data releases to allow our data users to evaluate improvements in the algorithm itself, improvements in the tuning and the nature in which the algorithm actually does its processing of the data. I want to stress the 2020 census data products are not going to be held to that fixed conservative privacy loss budget. On April 28th of this year, we released another set of privacy protected microdata files and detailed summary metrics, a new set of these demonstration data that used a different and higher global privacy loss budget. To give you a sense of comparison, the original 4 sets of demonstration data used an overall privacy loss budget of about 4.5. The new demonstration data that we released last month used a privacy loss budget of 12.2. And remember, epsilon is on a logarithmic scale, so this is a significant shift away from the privacy end of the spectrum towards the accuracy end of the spectrum. And we anticipate that this level that was set for the April demonstration data more closely approximates the overall level of privacy loss budget that DCEP will be considering for the actual 2020 census redistricting files. Then later this summer, in September, we'll release a final set of demonstration data using the actual production code and production settings that are used for the actual 2020 census redistricting file. This final set of demonstration data will allow data users to assess what the anticipated fitness for use of the actual 2020 census redistricting data will be. So I mentioned we released a new set of demonstration data in April. So I just want to kind of highlight some of the key improvements that set of demonstration data reflect. So what you see here is the mean absolute percent error of total population counts at the county level for all counties in the US across the 5 sets of demonstration data that we've now released. On the left-hand side, you can see the original October 2019 demonstration product, the subsequent ones, May 2020, September 2020, and November 2020 in the middle. And then the right-hand column is the new April 2021 demonstration data. And what you can see is we've achieved substantial improvements in accuracy for total population counts at the county level. You can see the amount of error has gone down significantly. And in these new April 2021 demonstration data, the average county's total population count is within plus or minus just shy of 5 people, down from over 80 people in the original October 2019 data set. There's been some concern about what is the impact going to be on particularly small counties. So this graph shows the mean absolute percent error for the smallest counties, those with populations under 1,000. And you can see substantial improvements here for small entities as well. The average error for these small counties in the new April 2021 data set is about 3.7 people, down from over 76 people plus or minus in the original October 2019 demonstration product. Here's total population for incorporated places. This is something that I know a lot of data users are concerned about. And again, you can see substantial improvements here, down to plus or minus 21 people in the April 21 file. And for the smallest incorporated places, those with under 500 people, the average error is just plus or minus 3.6 people, down from 43 in the October 2019 demonstration set. At the block level, we're seeing improvements as well. This shows mean absolute error for rural blocks, and you can see the average error is 0.9 people for rural blocks in the new demonstration file. For urban blocks, the average error is just plus or minus 2.5 people in the new demonstration data. That's down from 9.2 people in the original October 2019 demonstration set. And for occupancy rates, you're seeing similar improvements as well. The mean absolute error in percentage points for the April 2021 demonstration data is 0.75 percentage points difference in occupancy rates at the tract level, down from almost 7.25 percentage points in the original October 2019 demonstration file. So, as I mentioned, we've been releasing these demonstration data in order to get feedback from our data users, to allow our data users to evaluate the output of our disclosure avoidance system against the original published 2010 data, and to be able to provide that feedback to us to help us in our improvements to the disclosure avoidance system and in the policy decisions that have to be made about setting the privacy loss budget and allocating the privacy loss budget across data products and across tabulations within those data products. So these new April 2021 demonstration data are the kind of final opportunity for our data users to provide feedback that's going to inform that decision making for the upcoming production run of the 2020 redistricting data file. So we encourage all of you to assess these demonstration data, see if they meet your needs, and provide that feedback to us. The deadline for feedback is May 28th, just in advance of the early June DCEP decision making for the redistricting product. And you can send any feedback that you have to our dedicated email box at 2020-DAS@census.gov. Please use the subject line April 2021 demonstration data. Feedback that would be most actionable for us, most helpful for us, would be primarily fitness for use. Like, based on your analyses, would these data meet your needs? Would they be satisfactory? How did you come to that conclusion? If they wouldn't yet be satisfactory, how much better would they have to be? How incrementally would accuracy need to improve for the data to meet your use case? And have you identified any improbable results in those data that we need to be aware of? Feedback on the privacy protections would also be greatly helpful. Do these proposed products at this level of privacy loss budget present any confidentiality concerns that you think we should address? And lastly, I mean, there's a lot of trade-offs that have to be made when allocating privacy loss budget. Are there improvements in this most recent set of demonstration data that you want to make sure that we retain in the final design, so that we know as we are reallocating to meet additional fitness for use standards, what shouldn't we touch? Where are the data good and they need to stay that good, essentially? So feedback on those improvements would be helpful as well. If you'd like to stay informed of our work on the disclosure avoidance system, you can subscribe to our 2020 Census Data Products newsletter. Just search for disclosure avoidance at census.gov and you'll find it. We send out updates every week or two on the latest status of our efforts, new information that could be helpful. We announce when new demonstration data are being released and so on. And if you'd like to learn more about our efforts to modernize our disclosure avoidance protections, you can check out our website. Again, just search disclosure avoidance on the census.gov webpage. We have lots of great resources there, including videos, fact sheets, frequently asked questions, and much, much more. We're also doing a webinar series this month. We have one later today, in fact, on our top-down algorithm that's at the core of our disclosure avoidance system. If you'd like to watch the upcoming webinars, you can find information there. We also have recordings of our previous webinars archived there if you want to go back and see the ones that you've missed. And with that, I am going to stop sharing, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Michael. We have a few questions. One from Mike asking, should the PLBs be issued with margin of error values or something similar like they are with ACS products?
So that's an excellent question, and it's one that we've gotten a lot. The Census Bureau has committed to providing data users with guidance on how to interpret fitness for use of the actual published data products. What form that guidance is going to take is still being determined, whether it might be margins of uncertainty or assessments of fitness for use of different tabulations at different geographic levels in some other form. We're still working that out, but we have committed to providing some guidance to our data users on being able to interpret how reliable the various tabulations are going to be for different types of uses.
Thank you. We have another one. I've heard people in my community tell me that ICE or anyone else could acquire census data and use it to locate undocumented migrants. What are your thoughts on that?
So I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation that we have a legal obligation at the Census Bureau to protect the privacy of our respondents and the confidentiality of their data. And that legal obligation comes from sections 8B and 9 of Title 13. And what those provisions in the statute require is that the only people who are allowed to see the confidential census data are Census Bureau employees and those who have taken the oath, the Census Bureau oath not to disclose that confidential information. So the only data that we are allowed to share with the public or share with any other government entity who aren't special sworn Census Bureau individuals is information that has had disclosure avoidance methods applied to it. So yeah, other government agencies, law enforcement, they can't request confidential census data, or they can't get confidential census data. Only those with Census Bureau special sworn status are allowed to see the confidential data themselves.
Yeah, and I'll just follow up as someone. Many of us in the data center office have gone through with the special sworn status, and there's a lot to it, and the Census Bureau does a very good job.
Yeah, if it's the oath is not something to be taken lightly. If you violate that, if you disclose confidential Census Bureau information, it entails prison for up to 5 years and fines of up to $250,000. So this is something we take very seriously.
So it looks like we're still waiting on some questions to come in. Something I've been thinking about as more demonstration products come out is our ability to kind of make comparisons back and forth with the original 2010 data. I think an assumption I see a lot is that we can just take the new demonstration products and compare them to 2010, and if they're different in some areas, well then they're not accurate. But a lot of people don't consider that, as you mentioned in your presentation, that there were, while they weren't, disclosure avoidance, there were certain protections used on the 2010 data. So it's not really fair to compare demonstration to 2010 data and say, the 2010 data is completely 100% accurate in itself because there were certain privacy measures. So what would you advise is the most responsible way to kind of evaluate the demonstration products and make comparisons, or are comparisons just not advisable?
No, I mean, you should absolutely do comparisons, but you raise a very important point, and that's the 2010 data did have disclosure avoidance applied to them. The mechanism that was used for the 2010 data products was, as I mentioned, a form of noise infusion called swapping, where we would identify households that were vulnerable or the most vulnerable for re-identification, and we would swap the records for all the individuals in that household with the records for individuals in a household located somewhere else. So that did infuse noise into the published data. So what we published was not the information exactly as enumerated. So when you're comparing the demonstration data that we just released to the original published 2010 files, some of the discrepancies that you see between those two will be due to the noise that was infused in 2010 itself. Now, recognizing that, like, well, how else would you be able to perform your evaluation? So you do have to compare against the published 2010 data. And you do have to be cognizant that there's going to be some of that error due to the 2010 methodology itself. But on the whole, it's the best you can do to assess fitness for use. So just recognize that even were we to publish the perfect data with no noise infused at all, you would see discrepancies. Just recognize that and realize that the error would never drop down to 0, even if we didn't put any privacy protections at all in the demonstration file. So that's about the best I can say. I'm sorry.
No, I appreciate your response. I think, it's just a part of where we need to implement a little bit of critical thinking when we evaluate the differences between the two. So we have a question from Jake, but so he says, can public data be used to get such results? I asked him for a bit of clarification.
I think I understand the question. There are no limitations on what anyone can do with published census data. As I said, census data are used for an enormous array of different purposes, including uses by other federal agencies. But these are data that have had these confidentiality protections applied to them. But yeah, census data are used for allocation, like federal funding allocations. They're used by private businesses to decide where to build new stores, where to advertise. I mean, there's many different uses, but those uses have to be restricted to just the published data that have had these privacy protections applied to them.
Hi, Michael. This is Jennifer. As we wait, can I ask a question?
Sure, absolutely.
So I wanted to ask about, as we were looking at the demonstration data, we did see some cases where there was some blocks with what I'll call unrealistic data. So blocks with population but no housing units. In some cases, we saw some really large person per household numbers, and those are not things that we would expect to see. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly the sort of feedback that we've been hoping to get. And we've already been alerted to some of those, some of those improbable or impossible situations. But yeah, part of that is the nature of the algorithm. So the disclosure avoidance system top-down algorithm processes the person's the person's level data separately from the housing unit data. And that results in some inconsistencies between the two. We've done a lot to minimize those inconsistencies, but some of them have still slipped through the cracks. So when and if you identify those types of situations, send them in to our inbox 2020 DAS at census.gov. Alert us to them, and then we can look at seeing what's going on and attempt to get that fixed before we go into production.
Thank you. And then just as a follow-up to that, so you said that they're treated separately. Can you also talk about how the privacy loss budget is distributed? And you also mentioned that what was used in the most recent product more closely approximates the actual to be used. Does the distribution approximate that as well?
So excellent questions. So final decisions about the privacy loss budget that will be used for the redistricting data, and final decisions on the allocations of that by geographic level and by the individual tabulations within each geographic level. No final decisions have been made on that, and they won't be made until DCEP convenes in June to determine the final parameters for the production run. We anticipate that what's reflected in the demonstration data, all else equal, is kind of the starting point for what DCEP will be considering. But as I mentioned, we want feedback from the public because DCEP needs to make these decisions. They want to make sure that the data that we produce is going to meet our data users' needs. So that's why we produced the demonstration files. That's why we want our data users like yourselves to evaluate them against what we published in 2010 to see are these data sufficiently accurate to meet your needs? With the realization that there has to be some error in there, there has to be some uncertainty to protect privacy. Have we gotten those parameters right, if you will? And so we're collecting all this feedback that will inform kind of some final reallocations of privacy loss budget, or perhaps the addition of additional privacy loss budget for the redistricting data that DCEP will decide in that June meeting. So it's what is reflected in the demonstration data is kind of our most recent kind of starting point for what we think the final settings will be, but those final settings won't be decided until after we've heard from our data users and had the opportunity to see, okay, do we need to make some additional tweaks here or there?
Thank you very much for that explanation. I don't see any additional questions, but just to give folks one more minute, I just wanted to say a big thank you to you, Michael, for joining us today, for your presentation, and for answering all of our questions. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so very much for having me. It really was my pleasure. And if you have additional questions after today's session, feel free to send those in to that same email address that I mentioned before, 2020-das@census.gov, and we'll be happy to get those answered for you. So I'm seeing a question here, will zip code data be included? So the data that will be published as part of the PL 94-171 is geocoded all the way down to the census block level. And I don't know the full set of specifications for the data, the tabulations that are released as part of the PL file, but with geographic precision down to the block, it would be, yeah, you'd be able to assemble zip codes from that. Yeah.
So once again, I just want to say thank you, Michael. I think there were some thank yous in the Q&A if you noticed those. And then we're going to take a short break, and then we will start back at 11 with our next presentation.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And yeah, please send in any further questions you have and send us feedback on our demonstration data.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.